The morning everything changed at Teterboro Airport began like any other expensive Monday in New Jersey. Cold rain sliding down the glass walls of the Aerotech Meridian private hangar, runway lights blinking through a gray mist, and the sharp smell of jet fuel mixing with black coffee, polished leather, hot metal, and the faint chemical scent of cleaning solution on the concrete floor. In the center of the hangar sat Victoria Whitmore's Gulfstream G700, a $78 million aircraft. With a white and silver body so glossy it reflected the ceiling lights like a mirror. Around it, nearly 100 engineers, avionics specialists, software consultants, mechanics, legal advisors, and executives stood in tense clusters, all wearing expensive jackets, company badges, safety glasses, and faces that tried to hide panic. The jet had failed 3 pre-flight checks in a row, its auxiliary electrical control system flashing errors no one could isolate, and Victoria Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Aerospace Logistics, stood near the open cabin door in a charcoal gray tailored suit, her dark hair tucked behind one ear, her jaw tight, her pale blue-gray eyes fixed on the aircraft as if she could force it to obey by sheer authority. She was supposed to be in Washington, D.C. by noon to sign a $240 million federal logistics contract that would keep 3 American facilities open, protect hundreds of jobs, and strengthen emergency transport operations tied to military hospitals and disaster relief. Instead, her company's best minds were frozen around her private jet like students caught unprepared before an exam. Then, from the far side of the hangar, a man in a faded navy work jacket, worn boots, and grease-marked hands quietly said, "Ma'am, your problem isn't the software. It's one wire." Every head turned. Ethan Cole, a single father and overnight maintenance contractor, stood beside his 8-year-old daughter Grace, who clutched a patched school backpack against her chest. One senior engineer laughed under his breath. Another frowned at Ethan's cheap jacket. Victoria did not even look at his face before snapping, "Get that janitor away from my jet." The sentence landed harder than the rain on the hangar roof. Ethan's shoulders stiffened, not from anger, but from the familiar weight of being dismissed before being heard. Grace looked up at him with wide blue eyes, her little fingers tightening around his calloused hand, and the small American flag pin on her coat trembled as she swallowed whatever she wanted to say. The hangar went quiet for half a second, then filled again with murmurs, rolling tool carts, radio static, and the nervous tapping of tablets. Ethan could smell the heated insulation behind the panel near the lower access bay, a faint, burnt plastic note almost hidden beneath fuel and coffee, and he knew that smell from years around aircraft electrical systems in the U.S. Navy. He had heard the same irregular click when the power cycled, seen the same flicker in the cabin lights, and noticed the exact pause before the diagnostic system threw a false code. But to the people around him, he was just a tired man in a scratched jacket who had arrived before dawn because his childcare fell through, and he had no choice but to bring his daughter while he finished a night shift. Before we go any further, if you are watching this story from somewhere in America or anywhere around the world, subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from, because sometimes the most powerful stories begin with ordinary people standing quietly in places where no one believes they belong. Ethan lowered his eyes to Grace, forcing calm into his voice. "We're okay, sweetheart," Grace whispered. "Dad, did we do something wrong?" That question cut through him. He wanted to tell her no, that honest work was never shameful, that a man could wear old boots and still carry dignity, that America was supposed to honor people who fixed things, raised their children right, and told the truth even when truth made powerful people uncomfortable. Instead, he only squeezed her hand and looked back at Victoria. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I'm not here to embarrass anyone. I'm telling you because that wire can kill people." Victoria finally turned fully toward him. She was immaculate in a way that made the hangar feel even colder. Diamond stud earrings, a silver watch, flawless makeup, black heels that clicked against the polished floor, and a company badge hanging from a leather strap embossed with her initials. Yet beneath the surface, there was something hollow in her expression, a fatigue no executive assistant could schedule away. She had built Whitmore Aerospace Logistics from a regional cargo company into a national contractor, negotiated with senators, generals, hospital directors, and governors, and survived boardrooms where weakness was treated like blood in the water. But this morning, with the federal contract slipping away minute by minute, she was not in control. Her chief engineer, Dr. Marcus Bell, a tall man in a navy blazer with a $900 tablet in his hand, stepped between her and Ethan. Ms. Whitmore, with respect, we have avionics teams from Dallas, Seattle, and Savannah on this. We don't need outside guesses from night maintenance. A few men near the wing exchanged smirks. Ethan looked past them toward the access panel. It's not a guess. Marcus gave a short, humorless laugh. You diagnosed a Gulfstream electrical fault by smell? Ethan did not flinch. By smell, sound, timing, and the fact that your error code appears exactly 3 seconds after the auxiliary bus tries to stabilize. That answer took some of the amusement out of the room. Victoria studied him more closely now. The old navy patch, the rough hands, the tired eyes, the way he kept his body slightly in front of his daughter as if shielding her from the room itself. She hated delays, hated incompetence, hated emotional scenes, but she hated danger more. Her father, Colonel Andrew Whitmore, had taught her that aircraft did not care about ego. Machines respected truth, not titles. For the first time that morning, a memory of his voice moved through her. Listen to the mechanic who hears what everyone else is too proud to hear. Victoria's face tightened. You have 2 minutes, she said. Security stopped moving. The engineers went still. Ethan gently handed Grace his thermos of hot chocolate and walked toward the jet, each step echoing against concrete, while every expensive credential in the hangar seemed to stare at the back of his faded jacket. He crouched near the lower panel, and the knees of his jeans darkened slightly where the floor was damp from rainwater tracked in by work boots. His fingers moved with quiet confidence, not dramatic, not theatrical, just practiced. The hands of a man who had spent years fixing problems before they became funerals. He pointed, without touching anything at first. This panel was opened recently. See the insulation mark? See how the harness sits too tight against the bracket? When the system vibrates, the ground return intermittently loses contact. Your diagnostics think it's a software conflict because the signal collapses after the bus engages, but the source is physical. Marcus stepped closer, his face red. That's not in the maintenance report. Ethan looked up at him. That's the problem. Victoria's lips parted. Slightly, but she said nothing. Grace watched from beside a rolling tool chest, her small face pale, her backpack hanging from one shoulder. And in that moment, she looked painfully out of place among polished shoes, luxury luggage, and men arguing over a machine worth more than most neighborhoods. Ethan reached for a flashlight, then paused and looked directly at Victoria. Permission to touch the wire? His voice was steady, but his eyes carried the cost of being humiliated in front of his child. Victoria held his gaze. The rain beat harder against the hangar doors. Somewhere inside the jet, a warning chime pulsed once, thin and nervous. Then Victoria nodded. Ethan touched one wire, barely shifting its angle, and the entire diagnostic panel went silent. No error, no flashing warning, no repeating failure, just stillness. And suddenly, in a hangar filled with nearly 100 experts, nobody laughed. For several seconds after the warning disappeared, nobody moved. The Gulfstream sat under the white hangar lights, like a silent monument to money, pride, and everything human beings pretend they can control, while Ethan Cole kept one hand near the open panel and the other braced against his knee. The diagnostic tablet in Marcus Bell's hand refreshed again and again, but the red error line did not return. A younger avionics engineer from Seattle leaned closer, eyes narrowed, whispering, "No fault recurrence." Another technician checked the auxiliary bus data on a laptop, balanced on a rolling case. Voltage stabilized. The words spread through the hangar in low bursts, each one cutting deeper into the confidence of the men who had spent the last 6 hours blaming firmware, sensor arrays, control modules, and imported components. Victoria stood very still, her face unreadable, but a small change moved through her posture. The hard executive angle of her shoulders softened just enough to reveal that she understood what had almost happened. This was not a late departure anymore. This was not an inconvenience. This was a near miss wrapped in corporate embarrassment. Ethan looked back at Grace, and the first thing he did was not smile at the people who had doubted him, not lecture them, not demand respect. He checked whether his daughter was okay. Grace was standing beside the tool chest, with both hands wrapped around the metal thermos, her cheeks pink from the cold, her eyes wet but proud. "Daddy?" she called softly. Ethan nodded once. "I'm right here." "Gracie." That simple answer carried more authority than any title in the room, because it reminded Victoria of something she had not felt in years: safety that did not come from money, security that did not come from control, strength that did not need an audience. Ethan Cole had not planned to become the man everyone underestimated. 15 years earlier, he had been a 24-year-old Navy aviation electrician's mate from Norfolk, Virginia, the kind of young man who showed up early, kept his bunk squared away, called older people sir and ma'am, and believed that serving his country meant doing unglamorous work correctly when nobody was watching. His father had been a school bus mechanic, his mother a receptionist at a small clinic, and their home had been plain but disciplined. Dinner at 6. Flags put out on Memorial Day and Veterans Day. No lying, no quitting, no mocking people who worked with their hands. In the Navy, Ethan learned aircraft wiring the hard way, cramped, inside hot maintenance bays, tracing circuits by flashlight, while jet engines roared nearby and salt air corroded anything careless hands forgot to protect. He was never the loudest sailor, never the man telling stories at the center of the room, but supervisors trusted him because he could hear when a system was wrong. A relay clicked half a beat late, a wire carried heat it should not carry, a panel smelled faintly scorched before any warning light appeared. Those details mattered to him, because his first chief petty officer had once told him, "Cole, aviation is a promise. When you sign your name, you're promising somebody's kid they're coming home." Ethan had carried that sentence into civilian life, into fatherhood, into every cheap apartment and unpaid bill, because it was the kind of American responsibility he understood. Not speeches, not slogans, but a promise kept with both hands. Victoria Whitmore's past had been built from a different kind of discipline. She had grown up in McLean, Virginia, in a brick colonial house with trimmed hedges, framed Air Force photographs in the hallway, and a father whose pressed uniform seemed to define the edges of right and wrong. Colonel Andrew Whitmore had been stern, but never cruel, patriotic, but never performative, a man who believed that the flag meant duty before privilege. Victoria had adored him with the intensity of an only child who saw her father as proof that the world could be honorable. He taught her how to shake hands, how to look people in the eye, how to read flight maps, how to stand when veterans entered a room, and how to treat a janitor with the same respect she would give a senator. But after he died in an aviation accident during a stateside training operation, grief hardened in her like poured concrete. At 27, she had inherited part of the family logistics business and turned sorrow into ambition. She worked 16-hour days, bought out competitors, negotiated federal contracts, refused vacations, refused sympathy, and slowly replaced tenderness with performance. People praised her as brilliant, decisive, untouchable. Magazines put her on covers beside words like power, vision, and dominance. Yet every night, when the Manhattan skyline glittered outside her penthouse windows, and the imported marble floors stayed cold beneath her bare feet, Victoria felt the same emptiness waiting for her. She had built a company around movement, aircraft, cargo, rescue flights, and national service. But emotionally, she had never moved beyond the day her father's folded flag came home. Ethan's life had narrowed after his wife, Sarah, got sick. Sarah Cole had been a first-grade teacher with soft brown curls, a laugh that made grocery store lines feel warmer, and a stubborn belief that children remembered kindness longer than lesson plans. She and Ethan had met at a 4th of July cookout in Virginia Beach, where she teased him for overcooking hot dogs, and he pretended not to notice that she had the prettiest smile he had ever seen. They married in a small ceremony with folding chairs, barbecue from a local restaurant, and Ethan's Navy friends wearing dress blues under the summer sun. When Grace was born, Ethan cried harder than Sarah did, holding the tiny girl like she was both fragile glass and the strongest reason he had ever been given to stay alive. But cancer entered their home quietly, first as fatigue, then as appointments, then as bills, then as nights where Ethan sat in a vinyl hospital chair counting the seconds between Sarah's breaths while Grace slept against his chest. Insurance covered some things and abandoned them on others. Savings vanished. Credit cards filled. Ethan sold his pickup, then Sarah's jewelry, except her wedding ring, then every tool he could replace later. By the time Sarah died, Ethan owed nearly $62,000 in medical debt and carried a grief so practical it barely had room for tears. There was school lunch to pack, rent to pay, a child to bathe, laundry to fold, and a little girl asking why Mommy's side of the bed still smelled like lavender. Grace was the reason Ethan never let bitterness finish building its house inside him. She was 8 years old, small for her age, with bright blue eyes that watched adults too carefully, as if she had learned early that grown-ups could disappear even when they promised not to. She wore thrift store dresses under winter coats, kept her pencils in perfect order, and wrote notes to her mother on yellow paper, folding them into tiny squares she stored in a shoebox under her bed. She missed Sarah in ways that appeared suddenly, in cereal aisles, during school plays, when classmates brought mothers to art day, when she saw women with brown curls laughing into phones. But she was not a broken child. Ethan had protected something gentle in her. Every morning, no matter how tired he was, he braided her hair badly enough that she would laugh and redo the crooked part herself. He made pancakes on Saturdays when he could afford the mix. He taught her to stand for the national anthem, to say thank you to veterans, to hold doors for elderly neighbors, and to never judge someone by shoes, skin, accent, job, or car. Grace believed her father could fix almost anything, but she also knew the world did not always reward men like him. She had seen landlords speak down to him, office clerks ignore him, parents at school assume he was late because he did not care. Not because he had just worked 12 hours in a hangar before driving through traffic with coffee going cold in the cup holder. The reason Ethan was no longer working in a higher aviation position was not lack of skill. 3 years before the morning at Teterboro, he had reported an unsafe inspection shortcut at a regional maintenance contractor outside Newark. A supervisor, trying to push aircraft through faster for a profitable client, had asked technicians to sign off on wire shielding checks that had not been fully performed. Ethan refused. He documented the issue, warned the manager, and escalated it when nobody listened. Nothing catastrophic happened, but the company treated Ethan as the problem, not the shortcut. His file quietly gained words like difficult, rigid, and poor team fit. Those words followed him into interviews like stains nobody admitted seeing. By the time Sarah's treatments intensified, Ethan stopped fighting for his reputation and took whatever paid quickly. Night maintenance, temporary electrical work, emergency call-outs, subcontracted inspections with no benefits, no stability, and no room to be proud. He told Grace it was honest work, and it was. But sometimes, at 2 a.m, kneeling under aircraft with numb fingers and a flashlight between his teeth, he felt the humiliation of knowing he had done the right thing and still lost. That old wound reopened in Victoria's hangar when Marcus Bell looked at him as if his worn jacket erased 15 years of expertise. Ethan had heard that tone before. It was the sound bureaucracy made right before truth became inconvenient. Victoria's people responded exactly as corporate people respond when someone outside the approved hierarchy is suddenly right. They did not thank Ethan first. They contained the situation. Marcus ordered a secondary diagnostic sweep. The legal counsel, a thin woman named Claire Donnelly, pulled Victoria aside and murmured about liability, exposure. A vice president of operations asked whether Ethan had authorization to touch the aircraft. Someone from public relations whispered that nobody should post anything from inside the hangar. Security hovered near Ethan again, pretending not to intimidate him. Grace noticed everything. She pressed closer to her father, her little boots squeaking softly on the polished concrete. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and stepped away from the panel. You'll want a licensed Gulfstream tech to remove and inspect that harness, not just reposition it, he said. The insulation may already be compromised. Marcus snapped, "We know how to inspect a harness." Ethan looked at him for one long second, tired but calm. Then inspect it. The room absorbed the quiet challenge. Victoria heard no arrogance in it, only exhaustion. She also heard something else. A man who still cared about the aircraft after being insulted by the people responsible for it. That unsettled her more than if he had shouted. Anger would have been easier to dismiss. Integrity demanded a response. Victoria walked toward Grace instead of Ethan, surprising everyone, including herself. The girl straightened as the CEO approached, holding the thermos like a shield. Up close, Victoria saw the patched sleeve of Grace's coat, the frayed ribbon in her hair, the careful way she had tried to polish scuffed shoes, and the brave set of her small chin. "What's your name?" Victoria asked, softer than anyone in the hangar had heard her speak that morning. Grace glanced at Ethan for permission. He nodded. "Grace Cole. That's a beautiful name." Grace did not smile. "My mom picked it." Victoria felt something catch in her chest, but she kept her face composed. "Is your mom at work?" Grace's gaze dropped to the floor. Ethan stepped forward, voice low. "Her mother passed away." Victoria's eyes moved from the child to the father, and for the first time the scene rearranged itself in her mind. Ethan was not simply out of place. He was a widower, trying to keep breakfast, school, rent, grief, and dignity from collapsing at the same time. Grace whispered, "Dad said we still have to be kind, even when people are not kind first." That sentence embarrassed Victoria more than any accusation could have. It sounded like her father. Worse, it sounded like the version of herself she had abandoned in pursuit of becoming impossible to hurt. The jet inspection confirmed Ethan's assessment within 40 minutes. A Gulfstream certified technician removed the harness section, and there it was. A ground return wire pressed at a bad angle against a bracket, insulation worn thinner than it should have been, the contact unstable enough to create intermittent failures under vibration. The finding moved through the hangar like a verdict. Marcus Bell stood with his arms crossed, saying little. His face had gone from irritated to defensive to pale. Victoria asked direct questions now, and no one enjoyed answering them. Who signed the last maintenance review? Which vendor handled the panel access? Why did diagnostics chase software for 6 hours while a physical harness routing issue went visually unchecked? Why had a night contractor noticed what the primary team missed? Each answer revealed a culture Victoria had permitted without seeing clearly. People too afraid to slow down, too proud to admit uncertainty, too focused on appearing elite to listen to the man who heard the problem. When one executive muttered that Ethan had gotten lucky, Victoria turned on him with a look cold enough to silence the nearby mechanics. "Luck did not smell burned insulation," she said. "Luck did not identify timing drift. Luck did not ask permission before touching my aircraft. A professional did." Ethan heard the defense, but he did not brighten. Praise from powerful people could disappear as fast as it appeared. He had bills that did not care about applause, and a daughter who was already late for school. Victoria asked Ethan to join her in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the hangar, while the aircraft remained grounded for full inspection. The room was warm, with walnut walls, black leather chairs, a long table smooth enough to reflect faces, and a silver tray holding untouched pastries from a Manhattan bakery. Grace sat beside Ethan, swinging her feet slightly above the floor, careful not to drop crumbs from the blueberry muffin Victoria's assistant offered her. Ethan refused. Coffee twice before accepting a paper cup, because his hands were starting to shake from fatigue. Victoria sat across from him, not at the head of the table, and that detail did not go unnoticed by her staff standing outside the glass. "Mr. Cole," she began, "what is your background?" Ethan gave the short version because men like him learned not to sound like they were pleading. Navy aviation electrician, civilian maintenance, contract work, overnight shifts, no current full-time position. Victoria asked why. His jaw tightened. Long story. Grace looked at him and said, "Because he told the truth and they punished him." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Grace. But the child had already said it, and the room became heavier. Victoria leaned back slowly. What truth? Ethan told her about the inspection shortcut, the unsigned forms, the warning that became a reputation problem. He did not dramatize it. He did not mention Sarah's cancer until Grace did quietly when she said, "Mom was sick then, and Dad still wouldn't lie." Victoria looked down at the untouched pastry in front of her and felt, with sudden force, the poverty of her own courage. Outside the conference room, the company machine kept turning. Board members called. The federal delegation in Washington demanded updated arrival times. A senior advisor warned Victoria that admitting a maintenance oversight could weaken the contract negotiation. Claire Donnelly recommended careful language, a technical delay, not a safety failure. Marcus Bell requested that Ethan's involvement be documented as informal observation rather than diagnostic contribution. Victoria listened to all of it through an earpiece while watching Ethan help Grace with a math worksheet at the conference table. The contrast was almost unbearable. On one side of the glass, executives protected titles, liability, bonus structures, and public image. On the other, a father who had been insulted in front of his child was patiently explaining fractions with sugar packets. "If you split the muffin into 4 equal parts," Ethan said, "and you eat one, what's left?" Grace answered, "3/4. Exactly. But if I give you one because you didn't eat breakfast?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Then I'm the richest dad in New Jersey." Grace pushed a piece toward him, and he took it like it was a gift worth more than the jet outside. Victoria removed the earpiece. For years, she had confused sacrifice with corporate stamina. Watching Ethan, she understood sacrifice differently. A man accepting humiliation so his daughter could still see him behave honorably. The deeper Victoria looked, the harder it became to return to her old assumptions. Her assistant pulled Ethan's public records and employment history within legal limits, and the picture that emerged was not of a reckless contractor, but of a veteran technician with commendations, strong early performance reviews, and a sudden drop in opportunity after the maintenance dispute. His credit report showed medical debt, late payments clustered around Sarah's treatment dates, and no luxury spending, no gambling, no irresponsibility that could make his hardship easier for wealthy people to dismiss. Victoria hated herself for feeling relieved by that, as if poverty needed to prove innocence before compassion became acceptable. She asked Ethan whether he wanted to file a formal complaint against Marcus or the team. Ethan shook his head. "I want the plane fixed right. I want my daughter in school, and I want no one else signing off on work they didn't do." "That's all?" she asked. He met her eyes. "That's not small." The words stayed with her. They reminded her of her father's funeral, of the folded flag pressed into her mother's hands, of officers speaking about honor, while a young Victoria silently promised she would build something worthy of his name. Somewhere along the way, she had built something impressive instead. Impressive was not the same as worthy. By early afternoon, Grace had missed school entirely. The Gulf Stream remained grounded, and Victoria's trip to Washington had been converted into a secure video meeting. The contract was not lost, but the tone had changed. Victoria refused to hide the safety issue. She told the federal representatives that her aircraft had been delayed because an independent technician identified a maintenance fault her own team had missed, and that Whitmore Aerospace Logistics would rather lose time than risk lives. Her advisors looked horrified. The federal contracting officer, a former Air Force colonel with silver hair and a lined face, paused on the screen and said, "That is the first honest answer I've heard from a contractor all month." Ethan, standing near the back of the room because he had not been invited to sit, looked up sharply. Victoria noticed. Something shifted again, not loudly, not yet completely, but enough. After the call, she found Ethan near the hangar doors, helping Grace into her coat. Rain had softened to drizzle, and gray light spread across the runway. "Mr. Cole," Victoria said. Ethan turned, guarded. She wanted to apologize, but apology from a woman like her could not be decorative. It had to cost something. Behind her, Marcus, Claire, security, engineers, and executives watched from a distance. Victoria looked at Ethan, then at Grace, and said, "I owe you both more than a thank you. And before this day is over, everyone here is going to know." Exactly why. Victoria did not make the announcement from behind a podium, and that alone unsettled everyone who knew her. She asked the hangar staff, engineers, executives, outside vendors, and security officers to gather beside the grounded Gulf Stream, not in the polished conference room where corporate language could soften the truth, but on the cold concrete floor where Ethan had been humiliated in front of his daughter. The rain had stopped, leaving silver streaks on the hangar doors and a damp shine across the runway outside, and the air still carried the same mixture of fuel, wet asphalt, coffee, and overheated wiring. Ethan stood near a tool cart with Grace tucked close to his side, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder, his expression guarded because life had taught him that powerful people often performed kindness when witnesses were watching. Marcus Bell stood with his arms folded, jaw clenched, while Claire Donnelly held a legal folder against her chest, like a shield. Victoria walked into the open space without her assistant, without her phone, without the armor of interruption, and for the first time that day, she looked less like a billionaire CEO and more like a daughter trying to remember the kind of woman her father had raised her to be. "This morning," she said, her voice echoing against the hangar walls, "I looked at a man in a work jacket, saw what I expected to see, and insulted him before I knew his name. I called Ethan Cole a janitor. I was wrong." The room stayed silent. Ethan looked down, embarrassed by attention more than accusation. Grace lifted her face toward Victoria, searching for whether the apology was real. Victoria turned slightly so everyone could see the little girl too. "And worse than that," she continued, "I said it in front of his daughter." The weight of those words changed the temperature of the room. Some engineers shifted uncomfortably. A mechanic near the rear lowered his eyes. Marcus swallowed hard but said, "Nothing." Victoria took a slow breath, then held up the damaged harness section sealed inside a clear evidence bag. The worn insulation was visible even from several feet away, a small flaw that looked almost harmless until everyone understood what it could have caused at 39,000 feet. Nearly 100 trained professionals, including people I pay very well, studied this aircraft for hours, Victoria said. Ethan Cole identified the failure pattern by listening, smelling, observing, and respecting the machine enough not to let ego speak louder than evidence. He did not ask for attention. He did not ask for revenge. He asked permission before touching one wire, because even after being disrespected, he respected the aircraft, the people who might fly on it, and the responsibility that comes with aviation. Her voice tightened on the last sentence. "That is the kind of conduct my father believed built this country." Ethan's head lifted at that. Victoria reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and pulled out a worn silver challenge coin from the U.S. Air Force, its edges softened by years of being handled. Colonel Andrew Whitmore carried this for 26 years. He used to tell me that America survives because ordinary people choose duty when prideful people choose excuses. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. Mr. Cole reminded me. Grace's mouth parted slightly, and Ethan's eyes flickered, not with triumph, but with the pain of a man who had waited years for someone to say aloud that he had not been foolish for doing the right thing. Marcus Bell finally stepped forward, his polished shoes stopping just short of the oil-darkened patch on the floor. "Victoria, we need to be careful with how we frame this," he said, trying to keep his voice low while still making sure others heard him. "There are legal and vendor implications. We can recognize Mr. Cole's contribution without overstating." Victoria turned to him, and the old coldness returned, but this time it served truth instead of pride. "Do not minimize him to protect yourself." Marcus froze. The sentence struck harder than shouting would have. Victoria faced the group again. "Dr. Bell, you will cooperate with a full internal review. So will every supervisor connected to the last maintenance cycle. No retaliation, no quiet edits, no buried reports. We are not building a company where technicians are punished for telling the truth." Ethan's breath caught, because those words reached backward into the old wound that had cost him his career. Grace felt his hand tremble on her shoulder. She looked up at him and whispered, "Dad, she believes you." Ethan pressed his lips together, fighting an emotion he did not want displayed in front of strangers. Victoria heard the whisper anyway. She walked to Ethan slowly and stopped at a respectful distance, not invading his pride. Mr. Cole, she said, I cannot undo what happened to your wife. I cannot give back the years. Your reputation was damaged. I cannot erase what my words did to your daughter this morning. Her voice broke just enough for the room to feel it. But I can decide what kind of woman I become after being corrected. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and the whole hangar seemed to wait with him. Ma'am, he said quietly, I don't need you to make me a symbol. I just need men like me to be heard before something goes wrong. Victoria nodded, and her eyes shone now, though she did not wipe them. Then, help me make that happen. She handed him a folder, not thick, not theatrical, just a plain white employment packet with his name printed correctly across the top. Ethan Cole. I am offering you the position of Director of Electrical Safety and Maintenance Integrity at Whitmore Aerospace Logistics. Full benefits. A starting salary of $185,000 a year. Authority to stop any aircraft in our network if you believe safety has been compromised. Direct access to my office. No supervisor between your conscience and my desk. Ethan stared at the folder as if it were written in another language. Grace covered her mouth with both hands. And, Victoria added, turning to Grace, your father's medical debts connected to your mother's treatment will be paid through a family hardship grant from my private foundation, not as charity, as overdue respect for a man who kept serving after this country's systems made his life harder than it should have been. Ethan's face changed then. The guardedness cracked, and beneath it was not greed or relief alone, but years of exhaustion finally finding a place to fall. Why? He asked, his voice rough. Victoria looked at the grounded jet, then at the flag hanging beside the hangar entrance, then back at him. Because my father taught me that leadership means protecting the people who protect everyone else. I forgot. Today, you brought him back to me. Grace stepped forward before Ethan could answer. Small and trembling in her patched coat, and looked directly at Victoria. Does this mean my dad won't have to work all night anymore? The question was so innocent and so practical that several people in the hangar looked away. Ethan crouched immediately, putting both hands on Grace's arms. Hey, we were okay. Grace shook her head, tears spilling now. You always say that when you're tired. Ethan closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the fight had gone out of his face. He pulled his daughter into his chest, holding her tightly, one hand cradling the back of her head the way a father holds the last good thing in his world. Victoria watched them and understood that the real rescue that day had never been the jet. It was this, a child seeing her father honored instead of dismissed, a man allowed to stand upright after years of being bent by grief and bills, and a company forced to remember that human dignity was not an optional feature of American success. Ethan looked over Grace's shoulder at Victoria and said, I'll take the job, but on one condition. Victoria did not hesitate. Name it. Ethan stood slowly, keeping Grace beside him. The first program we build is for veterans, single parents, and field technicians who were pushed aside for telling the truth. And my daughter gets to see that doing the right thing can still matter. Victoria held out her hand. Deal. Ethan shook it. And this time the room did not see a CEO rescuing a poor man. They saw two wounded people making a promise in front of a grounded jet. A promise that safety, family, humility, and honor would matter more than appearances from that day forward. If this story of a humble single dad proving everyone wrong has you watching until the end, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more emotional stories of sacrifice, hidden strength, and unforgettable twists. Now let's get back to the video. 6 months later, the Aerotech Meridian hangar no longer felt like a showroom for wealth pretending to be discipline. The polished concrete was still there, the private jet still gleamed beneath bright white lights, and the air still carried the familiar smell of fuel, coffee, leather, and clean metal. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the tense silence of people protecting reputations. It was the focused quiet of people listening before speaking. Ethan Cole now walked through the hangar wearing a crisp Navy work jacket, with his name stitched clearly over the chest, not hidden on a temporary badge, not reduced to a contractor number, but respected as Ethan Cole, Director of Electrical Safety and Maintenance Integrity. His boots were still practical, his hands were still rough, and he still carried a flashlight clipped to his belt, but the tired slump in his shoulders had slowly disappeared. Grace no longer sat half asleep on metal benches during night shifts. She had her own room in a modest but warm house in Bergen County, with a white desk for homework, a framed photograph of her mother beside her bed, and a small model airplane Ethan had helped her build on the first Saturday. He did not have to work overnight. Victoria kept her promise too. The Coal Integrity Program had already retrained 46 technicians, hired 18 veterans, created a confidential safety reporting line, and stopped 3 aircraft from departing with unresolved maintenance concerns. For the first time in years, Ethan felt that doing the right thing had not destroyed his life. It had rebuilt it. Victoria changed in ways her board noticed before she ever announced them. She still wore tailored suits, still negotiated hard, still expected excellence, and still protected the company she had built. But the sharp cruelty people once mistook for strength was gone. She visited maintenance bays without cameras, learned technicians' names, asked about their families, and made it clear that no deadline, client, or executive ego would ever outrank human life. Marcus Bell completed the internal review and accepted a demotion before eventually leaving the company, not as a public sacrifice, but as a quiet consequence of a culture Victoria refused to excuse anymore. The damaged wire from the Gulf Stream was mounted inside a glass case near the training center, beneath a simple plaque that read, "One overlooked detail can cost a life. One honest voice can save it." On the wall beside it hung a photograph of Colonel Andrew Whitmore in his Air Force uniform, and below that, Victoria placed his old challenge coin where every new trainee could see it. During the first official safety ceremony, Victoria stood before employees, federal partners, veterans, mechanics, pilots, and families, and admitted something she once would have considered weakness. "I used to think leadership meant being the most powerful person in the room," she said. "Now I know it means making sure the quietest person in the room is not afraid to tell the truth." Ethan, standing beside Grace in the front row, lowered his head, not to hide shame this time, but to hold back tears. The federal contract with Washington did go through, but it became something larger than a financial victory. Whitmore Aerospace Logistics expanded emergency transport routes for military hospitals, disaster response medical equipment, and rural crisis supply chains across Virginia, Texas, North Carolina, and Colorado. More than 700 American jobs were protected, and Victoria required every new contract to include safety transparency standards modeled after Ethan's recommendations. Ethan used part of his new salary to pay off the last small debts Sarah had left behind, then donated her wedding ring, the one item he had never sold, to Grace in a small velvet box on what would have been Sarah's birthday. "Your mom believed kindness was a form of courage," he told her at the kitchen table, his voice uneven. Grace held the ring carefully and whispered, "Then she would like Ms. Whitmore now." Ethan looked out the window at the flag hanging from their porch, moving gently in the evening wind, and smiled for the first time without guilt. Across town, Victoria sat alone in her office, not in the cold emptiness of her old penthouse, but with the lights warm, a family photo of her father on her desk, and a handwritten note from Grace pinned near her computer. It said, "Thank you for listening to my dad." Victoria touched the edge of the paper and understood that no fortune, no jet, no contract, and no headline had ever given her what that note gave her. Proof that power could still become goodness when humbled by truth. 2 years later, Grace stood inside the same hangar wearing safety glasses too large for her face and a small navy jacket embroidered with Grace Cole, Junior Aviation Day. Around her, children of veterans, mechanics, nurses, truck drivers, and first responders toured the Gulf Stream that had once exposed the worst in the company and later inspired the best in it. Ethan watched from a few feet away as his daughter pointed to a training panel and told a younger boy, "My dad says wires are like promises. If one comes loose, everything else can fail." Victoria heard it and smiled, her eyes wet because the lesson had passed from one generation to another without a speech, without a board vote, without a camera. It lived in a child's voice. That evening, as the hangar doors opened to a gold sunset over the runway, Ethan, Grace, and Victoria stood together beneath the American flag. 3 people connected not by blood, money, or status, but by one moment when humility saved what arrogance almost lost. The moral was simple: never measure a person's worth by their clothes, job title, bank account, or place in the room, because real strength often arrives quietly, carrying old tools, tired eyes, and a child's hand. Have you ever helped someone at their lowest moment and discovered that your kindness changed their life forever? Drop a little heart in the comments if you believe love, kindness, and quiet strength are worth more than money, status, or any fortune. Subscribe for more emotional stories about second chances, hidden truth, and the moment a humble heart changes everything. Comment: love has no price tag, if you believe real kindness can change someone's life when they need it most.